Support Narrative's independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative and check out our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe and download. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Narrative Live. It's a Friday night special edition. I don't have any plans, and if you don't, hope you'll spend the next hour, probably an hour, hanging around with me because I've got a lot to talk about, and I need your help because some of this is requiring some thoughtful pattern spotting, and I know you guys can help me out with this. So it was an amazing week for the Democrats. There's no ways to say it any other way. What's even more remarkable is that the Republicans don't realize how badly beaten they have been. And they are continuing with the same strategy of saying, it's okay with us. What the president did is okay with us. Well, you know, they're about to find out in a very crude and dramatic way that what they did is not okay with anybody. And, you know, probably treasonous, probably even more, I guess you can't get much worse than treasonous, but, you know, the kind of devastating crime that has been committed by the Republicans in addition to the Russians, of course, by supporting them, has severely damaged the American national security outlook and certainly the way we are perceived around the world. Now, having said that, what a great week for the Democrats. I'm going to break this down for you. It's not rehearsed. I've just put a bunch of slides together, so please forgive me if the thing looks a little rough. I just want to make sure that we capture everything that maybe other people missed, which is there are still even more devastating holes for the Republicans in their defense. And they're so illuminating. They really are going to help, I think, crystallize for a lot of people how damaged the Republic has become because of what's happened in the last 3 years. The big breaking news just happened. Let me see if I can pull this up and actually show it to you because it just happened, but I figured out how to bring up a live feed here. So the New York Times saying that the independent IG report that the Republicans have been really banking on. They've been, you know, claiming that this thing's going to save their bacon, has turned out to be what we all thought it was going to be, and a complete indictment of the conspiracy theories, on the claims, on the weirdness that has been made up by the Republican Party and their allies over the last few years. Yes, I'm talking to you, Fox News, Sean Hannity. All those people who've been perpetrating these incredible myths against the United States have a lot to answer for. And it's certainly impressive that this IG report is very, very clear about this. Yes, it does rebuke one of the lawyers, Kevin Klein-Smith, for doing an email alteration. It should never happen, but it did happen. And no one will tell you that it's a good thing. I certainly won't. But it's very important for people to understand that we've got here a situation where the IG is now basically saying that Mr. Trump's allies have seized on the message from Mr. Klein-Smith and his colleagues as proof of an anti-Trump bias. But this is not the case because he's not a prominent figure in the partisan firefight of this investigation. So again, people need to be very careful when they hear what the Republican Party is going to try to spin out of this. The truth of the story is that there's nothing in here. An overall effort to seek sorry, I'm reading the wrong section here. At the same time, however, the report debunks a series of conspiracy theories and insinuations about the FBI and Mr. Trump and his allies have put forward over the past 2 years, the people said. So this is the section that really matters here, that, you know, there is no truth to what the Republicans have been using basically as their defense for the last 3 years. And it is why I was so confident last week to tell you that I believed we were heading to conviction. I still believe we're heading to conviction. I even more so believe we're heading into conviction because this president cannot stand and this presidency cannot stand. It is immoral. It is certainly not the kind of thing that should be leading this country, but certainly not for the country that's leading the free world. Having said all that, and I hope you got all of that, because I am playing around with a lot of buttons here, let's take a look at the big news of the week, and then I'm going to break it down bit by bit by bit, the impeachment hearings and things that you might have missed, things that might be helpful, and also what I think they're going to find in the next few weeks. So let's begin first with the starting block. So the starting block is where we look at the big news of the week. Haven't used this in a while because there's been so much big news. We've only been doing big stories, but some faces and images from the week you won't forget. An indelible image right there in the middle. The President of the United States, or so-called President of the United States, Donald Trump, saying, "I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo." Well, sir, you did, and it's now been proven, and you have been proven to be a liar. Now we'll have to see how it gets handled in the trial, but certainly does look like a bad week for the president. I honestly believe the GOP is in some sort of denial. I think that they've reached a point where they no longer are able to realize the fact that they've been so completely wrong, that they've been perpetrating lies, and that they also have, and I'll give them a little bit here, because they've been victims of a propaganda campaign, a sophisticated propaganda campaign. But you'd think with the collective knowledge of the Republican Party that there would have been enough people inside the party that they could have said, guys, we're getting duped. We're getting duped. None of this is making sense anymore. And yet somehow they continue to deliver lie after lie after lie. And the moment for me that really it became apparent to me that they were sort of in denial was that incredible exchange with Congressman Maloney and Sondland, where he just was refusing to connect these things together. He was refusing to see the quid pro quo as being something that benefited Donald Trump. And that refusal is, I think, symbolic and symptomatic of what is wrong with the GOP right now. Let's take a look at that clip, and we'll run through some of the stuff on the other side of this.
Who would benefit from an investigation of the president's political opponent?
Well, presumably the person who asked for the investigation.
Who's that?
If the president asked for the investigation, it would be he.
Well, it's not a hypothetical, is it, sir? We just went around this track, didn't we? When he asked you about investigations, which we all agree now means the Bidens. We just did this about 30 seconds ago. It's a pretty simple question, isn't it? I guess I'm having trouble why you can't just say.
When he asked about investigations, I assumed he meant.
I know what you assumed.
Company.
But who would benefit from an investigation of the Bidens?
They're two different questions.
I'm just asking you one. Who would benefit from an investigation of the Bidens?
I assume President Trump would benefit.
There we have it, see? Didn't hurt a bit, did it? Didn't hurt a bit. But let me ask you something.
Mr. Maloney?
Hold on, sir.
Excuse me. I've been very forthright, and I really resent what you're trying to do.
Fair enough. You've been very forthright. This is your third try to do so, sir. Didn't work so well the first time, did it? We had a little declaration come in after, you remember that? And now we're here a third time, and we got a doozy of a statement from you this morning. There's a whole bunch of stuff you don't recall. So all due respect, sir, we appreciate your candor, but let's be really clear on what it took to get it out of you. So my question is, when the president's putting pressure on the Ukrainians, withholding a meeting, to get this investigation that you and I agree would benefit him politically, what kind of position does that put the Ukrainians in, sir?
A terrible position.
Terrible position. Why?
Why does it put them in a terrible position?
Why?
Well, obviously, they're not receiving ultimately what they thought was coming to them, and they're put in a position that jeopardizes their security.
A position that jeopardizes
their security. Indeed, that's exactly the point that I think a lot of people are still missing. This is not some burglary at the DNC. This is, and in fact, something that damages the global security of the Ukrainians and the security of Americans. Now, the other big news of the day is this story from, again, the New York Times, the same report talking about a U.S. intelligence report saying that this framing of Ukraine, this consistent and persistent framing of Ukraine by the Republican Party, that they were the ones who somehow were able to, manipulate the American elections in 2016, and that they had reason to. I mean, why would they have reason to come at the United States? We're their allies. But let's say that they might have had reason, although they wouldn't. They had no capability to do this. But Russia has been persistently saying that it's them for the last 3 years. The Republicans have not been pushing this. You, Fox News, you've been pushing it. Rush Limbaugh, you've been pushing it. all those right-wing, Jack Proposiak, all those guys on Twitter, you've been pushing these lies for the Republican Party. Now, you'll deny it, of course, but you knew that this was Republican propaganda, Russian propaganda that you were perpetrating and sending out to the American people in order for what is my big question. How much money are you getting paid to, be traitors to your country? Because that is apparently what is going on. The report today is devastating. It basically says to the Republican Party, you're living in a delusional nightmare. You are not believing the truth. You're not seeing the truth. And I have to have some sympathy to this. There's a lot of people out there who, wow, they're going to find out that everything that they've thought for the last 3 years has actually been wrong, and they've been destroying their own country. That is a terrible thing to find out. On the other hand, I'm kind of satisfied that finally the intelligence community has come out so bluntly and said so. Now, two big news stories happening around the world that are worth checking out right now. I think let's go to Israel first, because I go to Israel because Israel's Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu is super close to Donald Trump. But more importantly, the backers of Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump are the same people, basically. And so Bibi's in trouble. He got indicted because he's a bad boy. He got indicted for a bunch of things. Maybe a look ahead to what might be happening here in the United States. But there's a big battle now for who will be Prime Minister. The next guy, this guy on the right, Gantz is his name. He tried to form a government, could not form a government. And the reason he could not form a government, according to Gantz on TV yesterday, was that he basically said that he was presented by a coalition who had, or a bloc, he said, that insisted on putting the interests of one man before the interests of the country. Now, if that doesn't sound familiar, I don't know what does. And this is, the Israelis have also been victims and partners of Russia during this last 20 years of Putin's extraordinary growth of organized crime into the Western world, how he's been able to, through money and through greed and through influence, being able to, take ownership of some really important economies, including that of Israel. And that is how Bibi Netanyahu has stayed in power. And it's now why this bloc that's been supporting him is just going to protect him to the very end, because they're part of the whole thing. And that makes them, you'll have to figure that out yourself, but certainly not loyal to their country. But nevertheless, it's very similar to what we're seeing here. The Republican Party is the same thing, refusing to see that the country's interests are way bigger, way more important than one man's interests. And certainly, why do we care so much about this one man's abilities to get rich or famous or do things? He's done nothing for the United States at all. In fact, hurt it a lot. And yet somehow the Republican Party sort of now exists to protect him. Why are you protecting him? Makes absolutely no sense to me. And finally, in the news today, this week, let me pick one more because I think I'm going to be speaking forever otherwise. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go right here. The moment for me that really, and this is a tiny little moment. It is a tiny little moment in the impeachment hearings. You might have missed it if you weren't paying attention, because all the witnesses were so fantastic, except for this one witness who is fantastic, but didn't get quite the spotlight that she deserved. And that was the Pentagon person who spoke, Laura Cooper. She was particularly interesting, and you could sort of see Adam Schiff's, brain working in slow motion, or at least I could, maybe because I was trying to figure out the same thing. She seemed to indicate that everybody in Ukraine knew on July 25th or thereabouts that the aid had been taken away from Ukraine. Now, that's a significant thing, because the Republicans, one of their biggest defenses, not that they really have that much to defend anymore, but their big defense is that nobody knew. So no harm, no foul. Nobody knew the aid was gone, so nothing really happened. There was just a delay. No one found out about it. Therefore, they couldn't have changed their lives, their tactics, their strategy. And when she said that people did know on the July 25th, it made me want to go back and check everything again. So I did, and I'm going to show you what I found out. But you'll see from this that there is a significant amount that happened between when the hold started. The money was meant to be released in February. It got officially held in July, but it was being held up all the way before that. And I'll explain why it was held up in a second. But in the meantime, I want you to take a listen to Cooper and Schiff interacting here in this really fascinating look at this particular date about who knew what and when, and the particular date we're thinking about is July 25th.
Javelins on that date. You got inquiries, your staff got inquiries from someone at the Ukrainian embassy who was concerned about the status of the military assistance. Is that correct?
Sir, that's correct. I would say that specifically the Ukrainian embassy staff asked what is going on with Ukrainian security assistance.
And did that connote to you that they were concerned that something was in fact going on with it?
Yes, sir.
And you received, I guess your staff received more than one inquiry on that date. What was the nature of the other inquiry on July 25th?
Sir, that was the one inquiry to my staff, but the other points that I had raised were emails reflecting outreach to the State Department.
So the Ukrainian embassy was also contacting the State Department to find out about its portion of military assistance?
Yes, sir.
So doesn't light your doesn't light anything on fire. Certainly was not something you'd spend a lot of time thinking about. Well, that's important, but it really is an important moment in yesterday's hearings, and here's why. Let's take a look at the breakdown here. Let's take a look at the timeline. I love to look at timelines. I spend most of my days looking at timelines. It's the number one investigative tool for any journalist and any investigator and any analyst. This is the way you find out how things go down. So here's Zelensky to win. I mean, people were not thinking that this guy was going to win the election April 21st. He was to say a long shot would be a complete overstatement. He was an understatement. He was really not expected to win in any way at all. And that surprise factor in Zelensky's win is what caught everyone by surprise. Because, governments do this thing where before they become elected, they make deals. And they say, well, if we get elected, we'll do this for you, we'll do this for you. And I suspect the Trump government had got into Poroshenko, the predecessor, and Putin had got into to Poroshenko, and they'd already made some deals. I'll break through what those deals are in just a second. But let's go through this timeline, line by line. I wonder if there's a way for me to put it up so we can all see it and talk at the same time. That's not going to work. Let's just take it full screen. I can explain to you. So there was a call on April the 21st between Donald Trump and Zelensky, and it was pretty congratulatory. They spoke about sending a very high-end official from the administration to the inauguration. They definitely spoke about supporting each other, and it was a pretty nice call. There seemed to be nothing wrong with that. But behind the scenes, I could tell by looking at this timeline, as you'll see in a second, that there was a definite concern that things were beginning to feel very, very awkward. And the reason why things were beginning to feel awkward is because for everybody involved, I'm sorry, just trying to, sometimes things don't work. There you go, this will work for a second. So for everyone involved, including the Russians, who have a big stake in Ukraine, things were looking really dangerous. They had planned on something completely different. They'd done so in concert and in secret with Donald Trump and his administration. They did it with their allies, the Turks, and certainly the Hungarians were involved in the process, maybe the Israelis too. They had an expectation that Poroshenko was going to stay in power. And I'll explain the reason and their motivation for that. But how do we know that this was a big surprise? Well, the first thing we can tell is that even though Trump did do this one call with Zelensky, Putin refused. Putin was like, I'm not talking to him. I refuse. I'm not going to talk to this guy. In fact, it took them quite some time. I think their first face-to-face is only coming up later this month. So he obviously had a different plan in mind. And suddenly you can feel how chaos began to envelop the White House and their partners in Moscow. May 3rd, this very unusual surprise call. I don't know if you remember this happening. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Trump has had a call with Putin. Now, the amount of attention being paid to everything that Trump was doing regarding Putin was so noticeable that to believe that a call like this could just take place, unless it was something serious, would be foolhardy. This was a very, very important phone call. And when they told us about it after the fact, they said, it was just a catch-up call. And they were talking about, things like North Korea. They were talking about the Russian hoax because it was just, the Mueller report had just come out. There was no mention of Ukraine at all in this entire trial readout that the White House put out. But in fact, you can bet $1 billion that the subject of Ukraine did come up, because there's a frenzy right afterwards. There's an absolute frenzy that follows on from that. The first thing that happens, and I'll pull back on the timeline in a second, is Rudy Giuliani and his henchmen. They begin to do their number on Ukraine. I'm told by people in Ukraine that it was quite a scene. These guys were coming into town, roughing people up, not physically roughing them up, but saying, you got to pay us money. And also, they began to tell people that the aid was in jeopardy, that the Trump White House was not pleased with Ukraine, and they were going to pull away this the funding and also the Pence from coming to the inauguration. So that's a super significant thing that the White House would have just found out about publicly, at least, from the New York Times. And the New York Times just published that yesterday or the day before. So now we've got Parnas and Furman in Ukraine straight after this phone call with Putin. And what are they doing? They're telling people they want money. They're saying that the whole thing is at risk. The United States may no longer be the partner that they wanted. Now that's a significant undertaking, a big deal, obviously, for the Ukrainians to take in. This is not their kind of worldview on a normal world. And then the second thing that happens is on the 9th as well, the ambassador, Marie Yovanovitch, I may butcher that name, I'm not sure. Anyhow, but the ambassador, Marie Yovanovitch, is it? I think so. She's told that she's no longer going to be keeping her post. She's been dismissed from her post under these ridiculously extreme circumstances. You remember she was at an event she had organized for someone who was fighting corruption, and yet she gets this call from her bosses in D.C. told, you got to get the next plane out of there. And she doesn't leave on that next day, but she does leave by inauguration day. And it's dramatic. Now, what did that nice lady, Marie Yovanovitch, have to do? Like, why was she such a mortal threat to the Trump organization, to the Trump administration, and to Vladimir Putin that she needed to be yanked up so quickly? I mean, by her own admission, she is an anti-corruption diplomat. She goes in and she cleans up corrupt places. She has, in fact, cleaned up a big chunk of Ukraine. So you can imagine if you're trying to do something corrupt in Ukraine, the last thing you do is want to have her in your way, especially when it appears maybe she wasn't able to predict who the next president would be, which, you could either say was bad analytical skills or she knew who her customers were. But either way, she was booted out so quickly. Which is interesting. What was happening that they needed her out of the way? They honestly needed to move some of those deck chairs of the Titanic quickly because their policy on Ukraine was sinking really, really fast. So then we get to this part of May 13th to let's say the 14th, where there is a flurry of diplomatic activity involving the Trump administration, Viktor Orban, who's just this incredible nightmare of a leader from Hungary, and Vladimir Putin and Pompeo. It's inexplicable to me how this series of events would have taken place unless they were trying to desperately coordinate something. Something had gone wrong in their worldview. Something very bad had gone on from their point of view. The guy they thought was going to win in Ukraine, he didn't win. The guy who won in Ukraine is a comedian nobody knows very much about, and he doesn't seem to be that friendly. On top of that, he's probably got his interests that are very, very different to the American or Moscow or Hungarian points of view. And so it was, you can imagine chaos in an already chaotic White House as they were trying to figure out what to do next. And I can say that that's what happened only through fact patterns. I deal in fact patterns. That's all we can say. But if you look at this particular set of circumstances, so then on the 13th, this is on the 9th, Maria Yovanovitch is fired. On the 13th, there's a phone call between, I'm sorry, I should say there's no phone call. There's a meeting between Orban and Trump at the White House. It's a very unusual, cold, odd day where they're talking about a lot of things. There's a feeling that Putin's in the room. There really is. It's very hard to sort of have this, to look at the news reports of that day and feel like, Putin maybe was on a phone call or at least listening in. He seems to be sort of invisibly present throughout the entire day's events. And so this is now the 13th. George Kent, who you saw on that first day of testimony, it was a really interesting testimony that he provided. You remember he was with Taylor. He was a guy wearing a bow tie. You remember him now, right? The very nice looking gentleman, the kind of guy you want to represent the United States. Well, he later on published in his initial testimony before closed door hearing committee questioning, he revealed this about what happened on that day. So we're talking about the day Viktor Orban and Trump are meeting at the White House. And he says, a conversation that I recall, and I took notes, actually dated to mid-May, in which we talked about the change of attitude and approach towards Ukraine. And that was in the wake of meetings that President Trump had, a meeting with Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary, as well as a call he had with the Russian President Putin in early May. And what was the change following those two conversations with Orban and Putin? This is the questioning. Well, Fiona assessed, this is Fiona Hall, who saw yesterday on giving her testimony. She said, Fiona assessed the conversations as being similar in tone and approach. And both leaders, both Putin and Orban, extensively talked Ukraine down. They said it was corrupt. Now, certainly, Ukraine has a reputation of a lot of corruption. It does not have that bad a corruption problem, certainly not compared to Russia's problem, but definitely not as bad as Hungary's problem. So there's a feeling that these guys were building a narrative for Donald Trump. These guys are bad guys, they're corrupt guys. You should be harmful towards them. Don't trust Zelensky. He's not trustworthy. We don't know who he is. And they're starting to talk the stuff about him being corrupt. So the next thing he does, takes two acts on the 14th. This is like a day after he meets Orban. I mean, the timeline here is so revealing that, you can't help but wonder why we have not been given these notes and why we cannot get clear visibility into what Putin, Orban, and Trump spoke about on those days. Because something severely big happened between, that phone call with Putin on May 3rd. 10 days later, it's May 14th, and so much has changed. And the most critical thing that has changed from a Ukrainian point of view is that Pence is no longer going to visit them. He was scheduled to be the guy who was going to be there for the inauguration, but then come May 14th, he is no longer going. President Trump instructed Vice President Mike Pence on May 14th or thereabouts to cancel his planned trip to Ukraine to attend Zelensky's inauguration. Instead, Secretary of Energy Rick Perry led the U.S. delegation. This is according to the initial whistleblower report. Now, according to unnamed U.S. officials, according to the whistleblower report, these officials also made it clear to them that the president did not want to meet with Mr. Zelensky until he saw how Zelensky chose to act. Those are such big words, such threatening words to the young leader of a brand new, of a country of a brand new leadership. But people had a lot of hope for this. So what does he mean by this idea of, they wanted to see how he chose to act? Now, mostly in our discussions around what's been going on with Ukraine, we've taken that to mean that they wanted an investigation into 2016, and they wanted an investigation into Biden and his son Hunter. That has been the full scope of what we think it has been. But when you factor in that Putin was so involved over those 10 days, right? We just looked at that. It was kind of incredible how many times Putin and Orban and Trump suddenly in those feverish days in May, how they had to suddenly be in constant conversation. Why did they have to be in constant conversation? Like, why? What was making those days so special that they needed to be in conversation? Well, clearly the only thing going on for them would have been what was going on in the world, which is Ukraine was happening. Ukraine was happening. Everyone was very surprised. As comedian Zelensky, hi, I'm back here. I'm just going to do this for a second. I thought this would work, although I can't imagine where I am. So, hi. Here I am. Hi. But let me help. Maybe this will help us a little bit. But you can see basically we're looking about April 21st all the way through to May 20th when he was inaugurated. And look at this amount of activity. Did I mention the biggest thing that I forgot to mention, I think? So on this day, on the 14th, where are we now? Here, right here. On this day, right over here. On this day, on the 14th, you can see the headline at the very bottom there. This is when Pompeo is suddenly disappears into Sochi land. Now, Putin has a lot of beautiful homes. His private, most revered residence is at Sochi, which is where the Olympics were held a few years ago. It's on the Black Sea. It's very nice, apparently. I mean, it's probably quite cold at times of the year. But in May, maybe a nice place to go. And that's where Pompeo was sent. Now, I can't underline how extraordinary a thing it is that you just don't get to meet any president if you're the Secretary of State. You need to, there's protocol. It's just protocol. That's the way things are done. Presidents meet with presidents. Secretaries of States meet with Secretary of State. It doesn't mean that they can't interact, but normally the boss is around. Like if Putin was going to meet with Trump, then Pompeo could go. But for Pompeo on his own, to show up at Putin's private residence, staying up late night, drinking vodkas probably by fireside, discussing the fate of the world and America. This is not a friendly country. This is an adversary. What's he doing showing up, in slippers and God knows what at Putin's residence? I'm sure it's lovely, but not a place for Pompeo to go. So this is an extraordinary visit that they suddenly undertake on the 14th. No real clear reason why you would find the Secretary of State in these high-level strategic talks on his own with one of the world's smartest and probably most evil leaders. So you've got Putin and Pompeo sitting there on the 14th. It's a very significant day. Just look at the amount of activity that goes on. You'd think Ukraine was the most important thing in the world. And of course, Ukraine is very important, but it's particularly important to Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So, keep with me here. It gets interesting. I'm fascinated, interested already, but there's a lot of other stuff that I'm going to just pile onto this. But the first takeaway to take away from this whole thing is Ukraine Gate, or whatever you want to call it, the impeachment inquiry, all those things, is not just about Donald Trump and Biden. It's not just about getting dirt in exchange for arms. It's much bigger than that. It represents the very pivot point that the entire world, the balance of power of the entire world sits. If Ukraine starts tilting towards Russia, it's game over for the United States and for the West. They've really got to fight back. So it's not just a front line. It's one of the most important tipping points in the world. And that is what these two great superpowers are battling over. Trump and Putin on one side, representing Russia, and the rest of the American administration, and the executive and the army and whoever else is left, hello, anybody out there, are fighting back. And we certainly saw the Democrats do that this week, and also those great State Departments and Pentagon officials and NSA officials. Fantastic to see so much star power and courage in those testimonies. So, but the number one thing I want you to take away is Putin. Putin's there every step of the way in May. So the crisis hits April 21st. And then he stays involved until at least the May 14th, figuring out a whole new strategy. What are we going to do now? We've got a new leader in Ukraine. We need to rethink our plans. At the same time, Rudy Giuliani has got his henchmen there, trying to get as much money as they can for absolutely everything else. And then Giuliani himself shows up in late May, and he wants to meet Zelensky in Ukraine. And did I just say that there's a protocol? I mean, there's a protocol. You don't get to meet the president unless you're the president. And Zelensky said so himself about Giuliani when he spoke about it to the press. And it's one of the things that made me think about that Pompeo meeting. I was like, that's right. There's no reason Pompeo should have met with Putin on his own unless it was super important, super urgent, super significant. Here's Zelensky talking about Giuliani wanting to meet him.
що колись пан Джуліані образився на те, що українська влада з ним не зустрілась тут в Києві. Я відверто про це говорив. Ну, по-перше, це президентний рівень президента України, але є певний шлях цих зустрічей. Тому я сказав, що я не зустрічаюсь в такому форматі. Ми хочемо потужних відносин, тому пан Єрмак зустрівся з ним сказати, ми готові зустрічатися, але на офіційному рівні. Президент повинен зустрічатися з президентом. Ось і все.
I'm not even halfway through. I'm going to go as fast as I can because there's so much other good stuff. So we've mentioned now Zelensky talking about Giuliani, and he didn't want to meet him because you're not the president. But we've also mentioned the most important thing so far. Putin is involved in every step of this crisis as Zelensky is made the president of Ukraine. It is crisis time. And there's a bigger reason than just politics and strategy for these guys because they only care. I don't know if you saw this thing in the New York Times maybe a week or so ago. There was an article about how Russia's foreign policy is all about money. It's all about profit. It's all about diamonds. It's about gas, about oil. That's what they care about. They don't have any values. They don't care about anything else. Their value is things of value. So they care about, in Madagascar's case, they cared about the diamonds. And other parts of Africa, they're doing the same kind of shenanigans because of oil. Certainly similarly in the Middle East. But in America's case and in Ukraine's case, it's all about gas. It's all about liquid natural gas. In fact, it's the biggest thing they've got, and why it's become a big thing is when the Soviet Union fell, they were still able to use a lot of their gas resources, which they provided to the Ukrainians, as a sort of a leverage. Remember there was that one winter where they cut off all the gas supplies to people in Ukraine? It was a leverage. It was a warning to them. It was saying, hey, you guys, you follow what we do or you're not going to get gas. And it made everyone freak out a little bit because, well, we don't have our own natural supply. The Obama administration back then immediately began the sort of energy independence idea for Ukraine and also the United States, actually. It's a must. To believe that this policy is not being implemented right now is so frustrating because it's the most important thing for global balance of power. And Ukraine has been, during that policy, has been encouraged to create its own natural gas supplies, its own independence. And they've done a very good job of it. In fact, the last few years, a bunch of oil and mining tenders or contracts have come up for tender, I should say. And these guys have recently been awarded. A few of them have been awarded just in May. In fact, and keep this in mind for the timeline, because this is really why I'm going into so much detail about this thing. It's right after this chaos, right after this crisis about what do we do? What do we do about the fact that Zelensky is now the president of Ukraine? Well, why are they so concerned? They're concerned because there are billions of dollars in natural gas contracts that they were bidding for. Both Russia and people tied to the administration are all bidding for these natural gas contracts in Ukraine. And they're doing it, and these contracts are coming up in June, and they want them still, and they're not quite sure what's going to happen with Zelensky's guys because he might not have the same, leaning as Poroshenko's guys, which they'd already gotten to. So, June 1st, we see the first set of contract going to an American company. I'll tell you who that was in just a second. So that goes according to plan. People are reasonably happy about that. Then June the 4th, it's cold shoulder time from the United States to Ukraine. Nobody's really talking to these guys. But on June 4th, there's Jared Kushner and Zelensky showing up at a dinner hosted by Sondland in Brussels. And then on the 11th, they fire the prosecutor. So you've got between June 1st and June 11th, a lot again changes. The prosecutor was the guy that Giuliani and company were hoping was going to attack Biden. So you can tell how things are going from scary to unknown to bad to really bad in terms of relationships between Ukraine and Russia. Between Ukraine and the United States. And particularly this firing of the prosecutor made everyone in the White House freak out. But nevertheless, they finally agree that it's time to have a phone call. July 25th shows up, and that is now the notorious, do us a favor though phone call, which we all now accept is just the way things happened. It was a bribe, it was extortion, call it what you will. But we've all thought that was it. There was arms for dirt. That's where it ended. I'm going to suggest to you that considering what we now know about liquid natural gas, that there was a lot else riding on that July 25th phone call. In fact, the next day, July 26th, another one of those tenders came up. It was awarded to the American bidders, but it was very noticeable that all the people who had supported the previous bid that was won by Americans back on May 1st, it was really noticeable how there was no visible support from the Americans at all. Things had gone really quiet after the July 25th phone call. Some people in Kyiv tell me that it was so clear to them that there was a chill in the air between American and Ukrainian relationships. There was such a chill that had happened that's the reason they feel like they were just iced out after this particular contract was awarded. I want you to listen to what Sondland had to say about what happened on that day, on July 26th. The same day this contract was announced is the same day that he met with Zelensky. People think that phone call at the restaurant didn't have very much to do with what had just happened previously. Well, he had met with Zelensky. There's a photograph. You see it right there in the middle. It was not just one of these things that happened. It was a significant series of events. We're looking at 24 hours where you had a phone call with Trump, a meeting between Sondland and Zelensky, and then Sondland calling Trump up at Kyiv's lovely eatery sitting on the balcony. It must have been nice. And then at the same time, on the 26th, this contract, this giant $billion bid is made to and awarded to an American bid. It's fantastic news. Shouldn't be fantastic news? You wouldn't think so, because this is how the call went with Sondland and Trump.
You confirmed to President Trump that you were in Ukraine at the time and that President Zelensky, quote, loves your ass, unquote. Do you recall saying that?
Yeah, it sounds like something I would say. That's how President Trump and I communicate, a lot of four-letter words. In this case, three-letter.
Holmes then said that he heard President Trump ask, quote, is he, meaning Zelensky, going to do the investigation? To which you replied, he's going to do it. And then you added that President Zelensky will do anything that you, meaning President Trump, ask him to. Do you recall that?
I probably said something to that effect because I remember the meeting. President Zelensky was very solicitous is not a good word. He was just very willing to work with the United States and was being very amicable.
Solicitous and amicable, those are good words. Also, he loves your ass, is one way of saying that to the President of the United States. So this is an extraordinary series of events. You've not seen this lined up in this way, this timeline, and that's why I really wanted to point it out to you today. There we go, on June 1st, a bid is awarded to an American bidder. A big tender is awarded on the 1st. There is a dinner between Kushner and Zelensky in Brussels. It's kept secret. We never get to really hear about it. Sondland tries to even hide it in his testimony, which I never understood why. But there was some sort of dialogue that went on between Kushner and Zelensky. They don't look very happy in that picture. Come June 11th, the prosecutor, who is by all accounts corrupt, is fired. And this is the prosecutor of Ukraine. So now you've got the guy who was going to help them out on the Biden stuff. He's no longer there. July 25th, we get that phone call, that significant phone call that we all now recognize as the phone call of extortion, the shakedown phone call, the call where it was, can you do us a favor? Next day, Sondland is meeting with Zelensky. Zelensky apparently is amenable. He has lunch with Holmes, the guy from the embassy. At that lunch, he calls the president of the United States. It's Sondland waiting for the president, and he holds it further away. Holmes can hear it. And it's Zelensky loves your ass, is the way he puts it, meaning he'll do anything for you. And on that same day, on that very, very same day, a huge $1 billion contract. It is awarded to a company called Trident. It's an American-Romanian bid for $1 billion. It's unbelievably huge. Biggest investment ever in Ukrainian history is awarded to an American company. Only it isn't, because for some reason they withdrew that. The Ukrainians in September, on the 15th or somewhere around there in September, pulled that back. They said there was something wrong with that bid process. They said it wasn't consultative enough. They should have checked with other people. There's a few variations of things that they were like, we have to go back and redo this thing. Now, the polite thing, if you believe everything that people tell you, you would believe the fact that maybe the process took a little too long, too quick, and it should have been more thought out, and other people should have been involved. I'm a little skeptical about this whole idea because it's a huge deal. $1 billion for Ukraine, $1 billion for an American company. For this to suddenly be yanked out from the Americans, why would they do something like that unless things were really going badly with the Americans? And guess what? Things were going pretty badly with the Americans. And the Americans aren't even calling their guy, the guy who started the company, or is at least the CEO of the company, Ilya Ponomarev, is sort of excited that he's won this bid, but he doesn't really know because he doesn't get any outreach from the people whom he consulted with before. You got to understand that these situations for $1 billion contract like this involves a lot of people. There's people at the embassy that are constantly involved. There are people in the Department of Energy who'd be involved. It's a big deal. It creates jobs in both countries. It creates support in both countries. And so you can imagine how important it was for the people of the American embassy that was stationed in Ukraine. And I wanted to just show you this one photograph as to show you how important it was. Because we're looking at now photos. Maria Ivanovich is sitting there in the middle of that one picture, but also on the left there, with Rick Perry. You can also see Rick Perry upstairs there with Zelensky. And then a whole group of other people involved in developing commerce between Ukraine and the United States. And it's huge. In fact, there was so much involved in the amount of bids that were happening at the same time that I could even fit them into a chart. This chart looks incredibly confusing, but I'll walk you through it step by step. So on the very left there is the deal that was awarded on the June 1st, Rick Perry, Michael Blazer, and Alex Chambers. Now, these guys have been close to each other for a long, long time. Alex Kramberg. Blazer has been a big supporter of Rick Perry's political career, such that it is, for a very long time. So he's not only benefiting because he's American, he's benefiting because Rick Perry likes him, which, sometimes is the way politics is. You can't really complain about that. Sometimes that's the way that is. So that's over that way, on the very far end of the picture that way, right? In the middle of the picture is Rudy Giuliani and his two buddies, Parnas and Furman. And that these guys also have a bit of the liquid natural gas sector at their disposal. They are trying to get the pipeline. There's a pipeline being built to help American oil come through Ukraine through Warsaw, through Poland, into Ukraine, and they've got a piece of that. The same guy, Rudy Giuliani, has a piece of the action involving that. And then there's Ilya's company, Ilya Ponomarev. His company's called Trident, an American company, awarded $1 billion deal, or at least contract, on the 26th, the day after this giant phone call that we now are so aware of. And then that's called into question in September. They pull it back, they're redoing it. The two people who could benefit, this is incredible, the two people who could benefit from this new competition for the same oil fields in the Dolphin, or gas fields in the Dolphin Shelf that Ilya Ponomarev originally had, the same people who could benefit from that in the new competition, because they might win that competition, are two people very close to Putin. And in fact, Donald Trump, one of Trump's partners in Trump Tower Moscow was Pavel Fuchs. If you've been following my podcast, you would know that he was in fact a huge friend of the Donald Trump family. It goes back decades. Was the first licensee of the Trump Tower Moscow in New York, and in Moscow, sorry. Friends with Donald Trump Jr., visited many times. It's a very, very close relationship. He's also the guy who hired Rudy Giuliani to do that cybersecurity work in Kharkiv. And this is where it gets super confusing. there's this other guy who's a really well-known billionaire, Ihor Kolomoskoy. I think I'm saying it incorrectly, but you can read it there. But this guy's super wealthy. He seems to be a friend of Zelensky's because he's a benefactor of some sorts, because he owned the TV network when Zelensky was still an actor, and he's now moved back from exile to Ukraine. So if Mr. Podomarov loses his bid for Trident because it's now gone back to competition, it's Pavel Fuchs, the friend of Donald Trump and Putin, and Kolomoskoy, I'm sure I'm ruining that name, who would benefit from that. Now, it's uncertain what's going to happen in that bid, but you can imagine, I can imagine, that there's a lot of shady things going on as we look at this. Now, I'm sorry, today's show's been just a bunch of information I'm throwing out there, and it's all I could do. It's just gather it all and try run through it. And maybe you guys, if you're still there, hello anybody, please feel free to add as much information as possible. I think this is big news. I really do. I don't think people have understood that there could be more in the quid pro quo than we realize. And in fact, why wouldn't there be more to the quid pro quo? This is one of the most important natural resources in the world, and also a natural resource that is of increasing importance to not only Ukraine, but a lot of natural gas flows through Ukraine from Russia to Europe. Europe really needs Russian natural gas. That's why they're building that other pipeline across the top. So it's a huge thing that Ukraine suddenly becomes naturally gas independent. It could really hurt Russia in the long run. So you can imagine how important it is for Vladimir Putin to make sure that those natural gas resources stay in his hands, right? He wants them to stay there. So you might want to stop the American bid from going through so you could let your Russian bid go through, with a little tip to Donald Trump so he gets something at the end of the day. Now, that's just guesswork for me. I'm not sure that I've been able to get to narrow that down. But I mean, you don't have to... it's pretty evident. It's pretty evident. You can see the dots. I can see the dots. I hope you can see the dots. I don't do any of these things lightly. I don't connect these dots, sort of as an armchair investigator that just looks at a bunch of things. Oh, they look similar. Let me put these things together. I take some time. I do the real journalism. I called around to find out exactly what the mood around this this particular contract was. And the mood in Ukraine is frustration around the fact that they're now being torn apart in the United States, that their support is at question, but also that they're now being played, basically. They're being played by the Russians on the one hand, and up against the United States. They have nothing against the United States. They love the United States. The United States has been only but a good friend. But because of Trump and Putin and this weird dynamic that they've created, suddenly they've been frozen out. And they particularly noticed that. They noticed there was a chill. Nothing was happening after the 25th. Now, this is such a big deal for Ukraine, $1 billion. You would expect everybody to be chiming in about how good it was. And there was crickets, nothing publicly said by any of the stakeholders in America congratulating Trident for the work that they've done. I'm not just saying that, not just my thinking, or that is my thinking. I called around and spoke to a few people on this topic, and this is a significant factor which needs to be looked at by, I don't know if anyone knows anybody watching this, but this has got to be looked at. There's no doubt that this bid for Trident needs to be looked at by the Congress. It needs to be looked at by the impeachment investigators, because it represents a whole new level of concern around how did this change of thinking around Ukraine really happen. So I called around, and I also spoke to Mr. Ponomarov. I wanted to get the word directly from him. I wanted to know exactly from him whether he felt like people had suddenly chilled towards him. It seemed like an unusual circumstance that after months and months of support for these American tenders and American bids for these tenders, that would suddenly be withdrawn. And I managed to get him on the phone for a couple of minutes only, but it was worth a couple of minutes. And I'm going to play you what he said to me. So this is Ilya Ponomarov. I asked him the question, did you get support from the likes of Rick Perry, from Pompeo, from the other people who had traditionally been helping you with this particular bid? This was his answer to me.
Yeah, we were surprised because our win was very much aligned with American these energy independence policies. It was the PSA that Perry personally has lobbied for. He many times repeated how he believes northwestern Black Sea is like the next Mexican Gulf. So he was saying a lot of these things, and it was absolutely natural for him at least to publicly comment what did happen. It's not lobby for ourselves. We never asked, specifically tell that Trident is good or something like that. We never asked anybody to do this, but we asked them to support the results of the competition and say, okay, great. So the competition took place, and we are satisfied that American company has won it, and United States would give all the support to ensure prompt development of that project, etc., etc. So something like that. But it didn't happen.
It didn't.
We
It
were
didn't.
surprised because, our win.
It didn't happen. I don't know. There you go. I
very
can stop in
much
this race.
aligned
Sorry.
with,
I got to tell you that making shows like this is difficult, and I enjoy the challenge. But I apologize for the technical challenge we have. I got to just underline what you just heard there. So there you've got the American CEO. And he's not American, he's actually of Russian and Ukrainian origin, but he's the CEO of a company that is about to invest $1 billion into Ukraine. On the day after the call between Trump and Zelensky, was expecting support from the American administration for his $1 billion deal, and got nothing. Nothing from Rick Perry, nothing from everybody else, nothing from the administration, which had previously supported him. I can't underline how unusual that is, any more than I can underline how unusual it was for Secretary Pompeo to go and have a face-to-face with Putin at his home. Let's sleep over, let's come over, no problem. Those two things are so unusual, in addition to that phone call between Sondland and Trump taking place at a Kyiv restaurant. You're looking at those three completely unnatural, unnormal, crazy things. These should not happen. It should never happen in a normal administration. And yet here we were seeing it happen in Ukraine. And, I don't know. I don't know who's getting money or if anybody's getting money or where the deal is. But it sure seems to me that Trump and Putin had a plan regarding Poroshenko. Maybe they bribed him. Maybe he got some money. Who knows? But they had a plan going forward on how they're going to move from with that administration and get the natural gas that they both wanted their hands on. Because at the end of the day, greed is what drives these people. Greed is what you got to look at. You got to look at what money they're making out of it. This is what they wanted out of it. And when Zelensky was elected, and he turns out to be a great reformer and a wonderful guy, and people love him, it freaks them out. They go into crisis mode. They change everything. They have the shuttle diplomacy going on between two countries that aren't really speaking to each other. And it's clear when you look at it from, in hindsight, that what you saw was a move to rearrange, reaccommodate this new reality that had happened in Ukraine. And that also might have meant rearranging their thinking around how they were going to get to these natural gas supplies. If I'm thinking about strategy and I'm thinking about who's going to come up with the upper hand here, it helps Zelensky, of course. It helps him to suddenly have this chaos, because he can go into talks on the 28th and say, I called your bluff. I saw you guys working together. You guys were working together, which they were. But that, to me, is the other significant thing that needs to be addressed by the impeachment inquiry. And folks in the Senate, you guys have to wake up. Republicans in the Senate have to wake up. There was a deal done, not between these Giuliani running around and all these other people. The deal was done between Putin and Trump to give up Ukraine for, I don't know, maybe a few $1 billion in gas or whatever it is that they get. That was the deal. And I think, at least, I'm not going to be proven right, but there is a deal there between the person who we elected as our president, as our representative, talking to our adversary, our biggest enemy in the world, and they're making a deal for personal profit. And so when you look at the quid pro quo, yes, it's about Biden. That's a side little fact of the Biden thing. And yes, it's about the arms, but that's also a side factor. Really what we're doing is we're trading away the strategic pivot that we have, that we are in control of right now, Ukraine. and we're letting Russia have it so Donald Trump gets some money. And I don't care who you are in the Republican Senate caucus, you are lying to yourself and you're deluding yourself, and it is worse than you think if you think you can get away with letting President Trump not be impeached. There is no doubt in my mind that he will be impeached. I've been saying it forever. I have no doubt in my mind that the Senate will convict. I know there are people out there saying it's not going to happen. Those people are wrong. Those people are wrong. There is no chance in the world that we can allow this president to stay in power, and everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. And what we're now looking at is much bigger than just the impeachment inquiry, which was terrible on its face. Arms for dirt on Biden, rigging the next election. They're giving away the global peace. They're giving away security. They're giving away what American soldiers have been fighting for in their thousands and dying for in their thousands since, at least the last 100 years. It is inexcusable. And I can't wait. I'm still looking around for someone in the Democratic field to actually say this stuff. It's obvious. We need people to stand up and say these things. It's not that people are anti-Trump per se. They're anti the incredible treasonous acts that he's done and the weakening of our position in the world. That is what is going on. And people in America know this. They know this in their hearts and they know it in the soul. And that's why you're seeing the election results we're seeing everywhere. But they're still having polite, conversations over crumpets in the Democratic caucus. Guys, this is a national emergency. If this was a world war, we would be acting like there was a war. It is a world war. It just doesn't look and feel like it. It needs to be addressed head on. We need a strategy that explains it. We need a strategy that reacts to it. And we need to know that when we get out of this, because we will get out of this, we are going to get back at him, because we have to get back at him. There's no way he's going to be able to allow this man, this incredibly, he's like a pirate, really. There's no other way to describe Putin. He's going around the world doing whatever he can just to rape and pillage. That's what he does. There's no goodness in his heart. There's no goodness in his soul. There's no value in everything else that they're doing. They're just pirates. And they need to be stopped, because we can't have this go on. That is only half the show, and I'm not going to keep going because I think I've done enough. So it's been an hour. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've been lecturing and going on a bit, and I apologize. Always, because you can tell this takes a lot of time, and my hair's turned gray and my voice is going, and I'm super tired because I've been up a little bit trying to figure all these connecting dots are. If you have some time or you care to, it's much more enjoyable for me and for you if you go to patreon.com/narrative and become a member and donate. Remember what you learned here tonight. You learned that Putin was calling the shots in Ukraine Gate, that Putin was in charge of what was going on. He was coordinating. A whole lot of shuttle diplomacy was going on. Remember that the election of Zelensky caught everyone by surprise. It made everyone go into battle station mode. They did not know what to do. And when you look at the movements, you can tell they were frantically trying to refigure out what to do. And the third takeaway tonight, which is just a must takeaway, is that natural gas was the surprise. It's not the surprise, is the thing, is the resource that they're basically after. These guys are after profits, and they see profits in natural gas in Ukraine, and that is why they have done what they've done. They don't care about you, me, or anybody else. They care about their own pockets, and this is how they do it. So that's the show for tonight. Thank you very much for watching. I was planning to do another show on Pavel Fuchs, and I might still get a chance to do it this weekend. It's just a mind-blowing what you can learn about what these pirates are doing, but that might have to wait a few days. Thanks for watching. Have yourself a great Friday night. I'm going to sleep, but enjoy yours. Thank you for watching. I'm Zev Shalev. You've been watching Narrative. Support Narrative's independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative and check out our podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe and download.